Salutations, tubers! Welcome back to the train room for part 3 of A History in Oak Age. This time around we shall be covering the Mpc era. A bit of an underappreciated era in my opinion. A lot of the train collectors that are around these days don't pay a whole lot of attention to it. It's kind of seen as a dark time for Lionel and Oak Age, but I kind of think it's actually pretty good because by the end of the post-war period, which we covered in the last video, Lionel wasn't doing too hot. Mainly because I think it boiled down to, as I mentioned last time, the rise of the jet age, the space age. People's hobbies and interests were starting to change. Model railroading was going into HO. This big gauge wasn't as popular anymore. But I think it also kind of boiled down to a lot of bad business decisions that occurred during the late post-war period. Now, for those of you in the know, the Mpc era tends to get dinged a lot by serious quote-unquote collectors. Nothing against you fellas, but tends to get dinged for a perceived lack of quality. The thing that a lot of people don't mention is that by the late post-war period, let's say 57, 58, 59, Lionel was already doing it. They were cutting costs on their locomotives and cars, some cases quite drastically, because they were losing money. They were doing bad. One of the more infamous poor decisions of that period would be the Lady Lionel. For some strange reason, the guys up in the boardroom decided, oh, we should try to market to girls. We're missing out on half the market. So they made, of all things, a pink train with pink locomotive and tender, pastel Easter egg colors, and as you might expect, it was a complete and total bomb. For one thing, any girl worth her salt who really loves trains, they really would want a train that would look just like any other train, look realistic. I mean, who in the world would want a pink train? And no little boy or guy back in those days was going to be caught dead with that thing. So what ended up happening to most of them, they got sent back to the factory and redone into ordinary train sets, which is why they're quite rare these days, and that's why, kind of ironically, the Edsel of toy trains is actually worth a lot of money these days, and the various reproductions that have been made over the years, they tend to go for a lot of money too. But I digress. Another bad decision was around 67 when Lionel decided to buy American Flyer. I don't know what possessed him to do it. I guess pride, haha, we finally won. The thing was, they paid all that money to buy American Flyer from the Gilbert Company. Did absolutely nothing with it. They basically just shelved it. So it was basically, I guess they were thinking they were going to take out the competition, but American Flyer was doing really, really poorly then. Well, by 69, enough was enough. The Lionel Corporation had tried everything they could think of to get the toy line going again. They tried some really weird things. Linex is one particular thing you see in a lot of the old catalogs, advertisements for like Linex fishing reels, 3D cameras, sportsman's equipment. By this point, they were basically trying everything they could think of to get out of the red, but nothing worked. So what ended up happening was, along comes General Mills, as in the cereal people, all Lucky Charms and all that bunch. Yeah, a cereal company wanted to buy Lionel, and the reason was General Mills was doing very well by this point, selling cereal and marketing to children, and they wanted to increase their market share, and so they decided to get into toys. And basically what it boiled down to, okay, we're doing good with the cereal, what do kids play with? Slot cars, model kits, paint by numbers. Oh, there's trains. Well, we've heard the Lionel company's not doing so well, let's buy them. And that's basically what happened. The deal was that General Mills got part of the tooling to make trains, and they got the right to use the Lionel name. And it got renegotiated a bit to where they basically got everything that had to do with the train's lock, stock, and barrel. But what they did was they folded it into a new company that they basically controlled. It was called the Model Products Corporation, hence why we get the term MPC. That's what that stands for. And according to my little cheat sheet I've got sitting here, Lionel was not the only company under this particular banner. It was also Craftsmaster, Paint by Numbers, MPC Model Kits, ringing any bells for those of you who are around in that era. That's basically where we get the term MPC. And they bought the company in '69, and in 1970 they restarted train production. And in '72 they renamed the division Fundimensions, but it was still basically called MPC. Some people call this era the Fundimensions period. But if you beg your indulgence for a second to look at this period box I have here. This came with one of my engines I just recently purchased. You'll see, aside from it being different than the post-war period with the orange boxes, right back here you'll see MPC of the Fun Group at General Mills. So this is, if you happen to buy a train from this period, this is kind of your confirmation that this is a Mpc era train. But yeah, make a bit of a long story short about Mpc. They basically moved train production from New York to Michigan, and most of what they did, the actual trains themselves, they really aren't that much different from the post-war trains. For all intents and purposes, these all are post-war style trains. There are a few little differences. A lot of it is plastic now, and a lot of the cheaper sets, well, the quality reduction thing is not quite undeserved, but for the most part, these are still very good trains. I happen to really like this era. And just a small little selection we have here. I mean, there's more, but if I put everything out, we'd be here all day, and I don't want to take up too much of your time. But suffice it to say, bodies might be of a newer, thinner plastic, but under the hood, it's still basically a post-war locomotive. It's got the Pullmore open. I don't know if that's an open frame motor, but it's the old AC style motor. Didn't really start using can motors till the modern era, a bit later. And even when they, don't want to get too ahead of myself here, but when they did the conventional classics fairly recently, they actually put the old Pullmore style motors in them. So neat little touch there. Anyway, moving on. A lot of people don't know is that even though Lionel basically sold off their train line to General Mills, they didn't go away. What basically happened is the company got reorganized into a holding company. And they got, in the 70s, they bought a company called Morsan Tents, which produced tents and sporting equipment. Eventually got renamed Lionel Morsan. And they started up a line of, get this, toy stores. According to my notes, their brands were Lionel Kitty City, Lionel Play World, and Lionel Toy Warehouse. Apparently it was the 4th largest toy chain in the United States at one point, and they actually kept chugging right along till 1993, and that's when the whole thing went bust and the original Lionel company died. Basically, the Lionel that exists today is basically the end result of what happened back here in the Mpc era. So technically 2 different companies, so make of that what you will. Basically lasted from 1970 all the way up to 1986 when Richard Kuhn bought the company, renamed it Lionel Trains Inc. And while we're on the subject of blunders, for the most part, Mpc did fairly well, but they made one big error that a lot of the people who enjoyed Lionel really didn't like, and it's still talked about today, that for some apparent reason, They were doing really well, but General Mills was starting to sweat, apparently, about the cost of the operation, and they decided in their ineffable wisdom, in 1982, they decided to move the company to Mexico and basically drag the costs down. This is just after they had restarted making American Flyer trains and S-gauge. So if you're an S-gauge guy, that's why we still have S-gauge now, is because MPC did that too. But what it ended up, the move to Mexico ended up backfiring on them. The workforce was not proficient at making the models. They actually missed their Christmas orders for that year, I do believe. Going by what I've heard from people who worked there and a few documentaries I've seen, it generally was a big cluster, you know what. So, in the end, in 1984, the Lionel returned to Michigan and they brought everybody back. But it was not to last, and in 1985, the company got spun off to Kenner Parker, and in 86, Richard Kuhn bought it, and then we move on into the modern era, but completely different kettle of fish. As I was saying, for brief little history lesson over, a lot of what you see here, I guess, could be classified as remakes from the post-war period. This is a little different. This is one of my favorites. They did have auto carriers in the post-war period, but this is actually a different design. They had this in the post-war period. They had the Mint car. Of course, this one's actually got silver bars in it instead of gold, which that's kind of why I got it. But for the most part, it's still a good era. And since the collectors don't pay quite as much attention to it as pre-war and post-war, you can actually get a fairly good deal. None of these engines sitting here on the track today, and this is my entire roster of MPC engines that I have so far. None of these cost me over $100. Got them fairly inexpensively from various sources, and the cars too. You can usually get these for a pretty good deal. So if you're looking to build your O-gauge layout, and we'll be covering a little bit more about that in the modern era with Menards, but this the Mpc era is actually a pretty good era to choose for expanding your rolling stock, because nobody really pays too much attention to it. I have had to do a little work on the engines. I've got one I had to redo the E-unit a little bit, but no different than any other train. So, yeah, that'll be the Mpc era. Next time around on A History in O-Gauge, we'll be covering the modern era, and then I shall be doing a couple spin-off projects covering little facets of O-Gauge not in the main series. And then I believe we'll be wrapping things up with the modern era and the future. What's going to happen to O-Gauge in the future. So, until next time, I'll leave you with a segment of one of these fine trains running, and I'll see you next time.